They marked a student for elimination, not knowing her world was hell itself. The file was already open on my desk when the human walked through the door. I had not called her in yet. She arrived early, which I noted. I noted everything about the beings who passed through my office. It was my job to notice things. The small things that told you before anyone else had figured it out, whether a new student would survive the Galactic Accord Academy or waste everyone's time. I had been doing this job for 19 years. I was good at it. I was, in fact, the best assessor the Veth Intelligence Division had produced in a generation, and I say that without pride. Simply as a recorded fact, her name in the file was Mara, species, human, origin world, all three, third planet from a yellow dwarf star in the outer arm of the Milky Way galaxy. Age, 24 years by their calendar. Prior academic record, attached. Prior survival record, not applicable, because the Accord did not keep survival records for species we had not yet formally admitted. That last detail would come back to me later. She stopped at the doorway and looked around my office the way most new students did, taking in the height of the ceilings, the pale blue light that Veth buildings used as standard illumination, the faint hum of the gravity equalizer installed beneath the floor. Most students from lower gravity worlds swayed slightly when they first walked in. Their bodies needed a moment to adjust. Mara Ellis did not sway. She walked to the chair across from my desk and sat down with the steady ease of someone who had simply walked into a room and found a chair and sat in it. Nothing dramatic, nothing difficult. I found that mildly interesting for about 3 seconds, and then I looked back at the file. "You are Mara Ellis," I said. I was not asking. I was confirming. "Yes," she said. I turned one page in the file. Her academic scores from her home planet were, by our translation equivalents, quite strong: mathematics, xenolinguistics, biological sciences. Her physical assessment from the intake screening 3 days ago was flagged, which was why she was sitting in my office instead of beginning her second week of coursework, like the other new students. "Your physical assessment came back with several irregularities," I said. "Your bone density reading overloaded the scanner at Station 4. The medical technician thought the equipment was malfunctioning." She nodded slowly. "I was told. I think it frightened him a little." "It did," I said. I kept my voice flat. "He submitted a report asking for the scanner to be recalibrated. We recalibrated it. We ran the scan again. The reading was the same." She waited. She had the kind of stills that some beings wore like armor. Not frozen, not nervous, just patient. Waiting was not difficult for her. I got the impression that very few things were difficult for her, though I could not yet explain why I thought that. "Your resting muscle activation pattern also flagged," I continued. The intake physician noted that even at rest, your core musculature is engaged at a level our charts associate with active physical exertion in most species. He assumed there was a calibration problem with that instrument as well. "There probably wasn't," she said. "No," I agreed. "There probably wasn't." I closed the file. I looked at her directly for the first time since she had sat down. She was unremarkable in appearance. Medium height, short dark hair, pale skin with a faint scattered pattern of small marks across her nose and cheeks that I later learned humans called freckles, which were caused by their sun. Her eyes were the color of weathered stone, gray with a hint of green. She wore the standard academy uniform, which fit well enough but had clearly been adjusted at the shoulders and the sleeves. Broader, I noted. Her frame was broader than the standard template assumed for a human of her height. She was looking back at me with the same calm attention she had brought to the room. "I am going to be direct with you," I said. "Please," she said. "Your admission to this academy was a diplomatic arrangement. Sol 3's representative body submitted a formal application for observer status with the Galactic Accord 14 months ago. As part of the preliminary engagement process, the Accord agreed to accept one human student into the academy as a gesture of openness. You are that student. You are not here because our assessment committee selected you on merit. You are here because your planet needed a symbol." I watched her face. She did not flinch. She did not look away. She said, "I know." That was not the response I had expected. I had expected either defensiveness or that particular human expression. I had read about it in the xenobehavioral reports, where the face goes still and the jaw tightens before someone says something they have calculated to sound reasonable. She said nothing else. She simply waited. "You know," I repeated. "They told me before I left," she said. "They said I was going as a representative, not as a top candidate. They said I should expect to be underestimated." She paused, then added, "They were right." I held her gaze for a moment longer than I normally would have. Then I looked back at the file and turned to the section that concerned me most. Not the scanner readings, not the physical flags, but the academic pace report from her first week. She had fallen behind in xenobiology by 3 assignments. She had attended the introductory gravitational physics lecture and then not returned for the second. She had eaten the wrong meal from the common cafeteria on her second day, apparently because the translation panel on the food dispenser was labeled in a dialect of written Veth that she had not yet studied, and she had spent 24 hours in the medical bay afterward. None of these things were unusual for a first-week student. All of them, combined with her origins and the nature of her admission, made her an easy case to process. The Accord Academy was not a place for symbols. It was a place for beings who could contribute, who could grow, who could one day serve the joint interests of species that had spent centuries building something worth protecting. A student who was here as a political favor, who was struggling in her first week, whose very physical data was confusing our instruments. She was a resource drain. My job was to find these students early and redirect them before too much time was wasted on either side. I had already drafted the recommendation. It was sitting in my outgoing queue, ready to be submitted that afternoon. I should have submitted it before she walked in. "You missed the second gravitational physics lecture," I said. "I was in the library," she said. The first lecture covered material I had already studied on my own before arriving. The second lecture, based on the schedule, covered the same material at a slower pace. I used the time to read ahead into the third week material instead. I looked at her. "You should have attended." "I know," she said. "I'll attend from now on." I didn't realize attendance was mandatory regardless of prior knowledge. That's my mistake. I made a note in the file. Then I asked the cafeteria incident. "I read the wrong label," she said. "The middle column on the dispenser panel uses a dialect variant that wasn't in my pre-departure language packet. I've since learned it. It won't happen again." "In 24 hours," I said. "You learned a dialect variant that most incoming students take 3 weeks to acquire." She shrugged. "I had time. I was in the medical bay." I sat back in my chair and studied her. There was something I could not name yet, something that sat at the edge of my professional instinct and would not quite come into focus. She was not what I had expected. I had expected someone overwhelmed, someone clinging to a position they had not earned, someone already halfway to asking to go home. Instead, I had a young woman who had walked into my office early, sat with perfect stillness, acknowledged every weakness I raised without embarrassment, and corrected 2 of those weaknesses before I had finished listing them. I picked up the file. I looked at the recommendation in my outgoing queue, the one I had drafted before she arrived. I did not submit it. I told myself it was because I needed more data. That was the professional reason. The honest reason was smaller and more uncomfortable. I was not yet sure I was right about her, and in 19 years of doing this job, I had learned to respect the moments when I was not sure. "You have a re-examination in xenobiology scheduled for next week," I said. "You will need to complete the 3 missing assignments before then. If you pass the re-examination with a grade in the upper third, your academic standing will be considered satisfactory for the remainder of the term." She nodded. "I understand. You will also attend every scheduled lecture going forward, regardless of whether you believe you already know the material." "Agreed," she said. "And you will stop eating from the center column of the cafeteria dispenser until your Veth dialect reading is formally tested and certified." The corner of her mouth moved just slightly. It was almost a smile. "Also agreed." I dismissed her. She stood, straightened her jacket, and walked back to the door with the same easy, unhurried movement she had entered with. At the door, she paused and looked back at me. "For what it's worth," she said, "I didn't come here to be a symbol. I came here because my world needs what this place teaches. I intend to learn it." She left before I could respond. I sat in my office for a moment longer than I needed to. Then I pulled up her file again and read it from the beginning. Not the academic records. Not the physical flags. I read the section I had barely glanced at when the file first arrived. The section on Sol itself. The origin world. The planet that had produced this unremarkable, patient, quietly immovable young woman who had just sat across from me and absorbed every criticism I offered without blinking. The section was short. A standard Accord summary for newly contacted worlds. Yellow dwarf star, 1 natural satellite. Nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere. Moderate axial tilt. Surface gravity, 1 standard Earth unit, which I noted was 35% higher than Veth Prime standard. I read that number twice. 35% higher. She had been walking around this campus, adjusting to what she probably experienced as unusually low gravity, and I had been noting how well she sat still. There was a small redaction block at the bottom of the Origin World summary. A gray bar where a section of text had been sealed under Accord Emergency Protocol classification. I had seen redaction blocks before. They were common for worlds in active conflict zones, or worlds with unusual biohazard profiles. I had never seen one on the file of a diplomatic student admission. I looked at the gray bar for a long time. Then I looked at the outgoing queue, where my recommendation still sat unsigned waiting. I did not submit it that day. I would later understand, about one conversation away from the single greatest error of professional judgment I had ever been at risk of making. At the time, I told myself I was simply following the data. But the truth was simpler than that. The truth was that Mara Ellis had walked into my office, answered every question with quiet precision, told me she intended to learn, and walked out. And something in that sequence had made me want to know what was hiding under that gray bar. The next morning I found out. There is a specific silence that falls over a room when you read something that changes the way you understand everything that came before it. I know that silence well now. I had never known it before that morning. I had a clearance level that, in theory, gave me access to Origin World files for the purpose of student assessment. The redaction on Mara Ellis's file was sealed under Emergency Protocol 7, which was technically above standard assessor access. In 19 years I had never used the override code that would have allowed me to request a higher clearance review. It existed, in the regulations, as a tool for exactly this kind of situation. A student whose background raised questions that standard data did not answer. I told myself that was why I used it. By mid-morning the full Sol Origin file was on my desk. I did not move from that desk for 4 hours. Sol 3, the planet that humans called Earth, had a surface gravity 35% stronger than Veth Prime, which I already knew. What I had not understood, before reading the full file, was what 35% stronger gravity does to a species over several 100,000 years of biological evolution. It does not simply make them heavier. It rebuilds them from the inside out. It compresses the skeleton, increases bone mineral density to levels that our medical scanners read as structural anomalies. It thickens the muscle tissue, not just in volume but in fiber composition. Human skeletal muscle contains a higher proportion of what the file described as fast twitch fibers than almost any species the Accord had catalogued. Their hearts are large relative to body size. Their lung capacity is disproportionate. Their circulatory systems move blood under pressure that would rupture the vessels of a Veth adult. All of this I read in the first section, the biology, the engineering of them. Then I turned to the second section, the history. I want to be clear about what I mean when I say the history of Earth changed the way I thought about everything. I do not mean that I found one surprising fact and adjusted my expectations. I mean that I read 300 pages of condensed, translated historical record and understood, by the end of it, that I had been looking at Mara Ellis the way someone might look at the surface of a frozen lake and conclude it was a flat, safe, empty thing, when below the surface, for kilometers down, there was something enormous and ancient and very much alive. Humans had been in continuous conflict with each other for the entirety of their recorded history, not occasional conflict, continuous, border disputes escalating to full-scale wars, wars that consumed entire continents. 2 events in their recent history that the file described as near extinction level. Events that they themselves had caused, with weapons they had invented and from which they had recovered, not just survived, recovered, rebuilt. In one case, within 2 generations, they had not only rebuilt the affected regions, but had expanded their technological capacity significantly in the decades that followed, as if the catastrophe had stripped away what was unnecessary and left only the parts of them that were very hard to discourage. The file included a section on their immune system that I read 3 times before I believed it. Earth's biosphere, the living ecosystem of the planet, the sum of all its organisms, was described in the Accord's biological hazard classification index as an extreme hazard environment, not moderate, not high, extreme. The category reserved for worlds where the biology itself constitutes a threat to visiting species. Earth had evolved thousands of microscopic organisms, bacteria, viruses, fungi, that were capable of infecting and killing beings with no prior exposure. The planet was, in a very real biological sense, a trap for anything that landed on it without preparation. Humans were not immune to these organisms. That was the part that took me a moment to process. They were not immune. They got sick. They had diseases. They died from infections, from the very microscopic life that covered every surface of their world. But their immune systems, built over hundreds of thousands of years of living inside that hazard zone, had developed a response capacity that was unlike anything in the Accord's medical database. Their bodies did not simply defend against pathogens. They learned from them. In real time, they recorded every invader, built specific counteragents, and stored that information permanently. Every human adult was walking around with a biological database of hundreds of thousands of defeated threats, updated continuously throughout their lives. The Accord medical analyst who wrote this section had added a personal note in the margin of the translated document. It said, "If we are being precise about this, the human immune system is less a shield and more a library that also happens to know how to fight." I thought about the 24 hours Mara Ellis had spent in our medical bay after eating the wrong food. She had not been incapacitated. She had not been in serious distress. She had been mildly uncomfortable and had used the time to study dialect variants. Our medical staff had noted in her intake chart that her recovery rate from the dietary reaction was approximately 4 times faster than the projected timeline for a human patient. I thought about that number now differently than I had before. I kept reading. The planet's megafauna, the large animals of Earth, were the product of the same evolutionary arms race that had produced humans. Everything on that world had developed alongside a species that was intelligent, organized, and relentless. The animals that had survived were the ones that were fast enough, strong enough, or dangerous enough to remain relevant in a world that contained human beings. The ones that were not fast, strong, or dangerous enough had largely ceased to exist. Not because humans had intentionally removed them, though that had happened in many cases, but because the natural pressure of sharing a planet with an apex intelligence that built tools, coordinated in large groups, and remembered everything had simply filtered the biosphere over time. The animals that remained were, by every metric the Accord used to classify fauna, exceptional. Predators with chemical defense systems, creatures with natural armor, organisms that used venom complex enough to interfere with nervous systems at the molecular level, insects that could strip the surface of a harvested field in hours, sea life of sufficient size that early human ocean travel was conducted, for thousands of years, in full awareness that something larger than their vessels might be moving beneath them. And humans lived there, farmed it, walked through it, swam in those oceans, let their children grow up in it, called it home and loved it with a ferocity that the Accord's xenopsychology section described as difficult to categorize because it did not match any standard model for how species relate to their environments. Most species, when their environment is hostile, develop one of two long-term responses: avoidance or elimination. They move away from the threat, or they remove it. Humans had done neither. They had learned to read the danger, predict it, manage it, and continue walking forward through it. They hiked into the habitats of the most dangerous animals on their world for recreation, not to fight, not to study, for relaxation, because the xenopsychology report noted with what I interpreted as quiet disbelief. They found something called nature to be peaceful. I sat with that for a while. Then I got to the section on their pain response. The VETH pain threshold in our medical classification is rated as moderate high on the Accord standard scale. We process pain efficiently and respond to it as the signal it is, by withdrawing from the source, protecting the affected area, and seeking treatment. Our threshold is not low. We are not fragile, but we respect pain as information, and we act on that information promptly. The human pain response, according to the data from preliminary medical examinations conducted during first contact protocols, worked differently. Humans experienced pain with full intensity. Their nervous system was not blunted, was not less sensitive. They felt it completely. But the signal had, over their evolutionary history, been partially decoupled from the behavioral response. Put simply, pain told a human that something was wrong. It did not automatically stop them from continuing to do whatever they were doing. The file cited examples from their own medical records. Human individuals who had sustained injuries mid-activity and continued that activity, hours before seeking treatment, not because they were unaware of the injury, because they had decided to finish what they were doing first. Their own doctors had terms for this: sports medicine, trauma psychology, injury continuation, entire fields of study built around the documented reality that a human being in the middle of something they considered important would frequently decide that the injury was a problem to be addressed later. I thought about Mara Ellis walking into my office and sitting with perfect stillness for 20 minutes. I thought about her bone density overloading the scanner. I thought about her learning a dialect variant in a medical bay while recovering from a dietary reaction. I thought about the gray bar that had been sitting on the bottom of her student file, and the fact that someone in the Accord diplomatic office had decided that this information, all of this information, was classified above standard assessor access. which meant that the people responsible for evaluating this student had been deliberately kept from knowing what she actually was. I pulled up her academic record again. The 3 missing xenobiology assignments, the skipped lecture, the cafeteria incident, the physical scan anomalies, all of it, every single flag in her file looked different now. The missing assignments were not negligence. She had been reading ahead. The lecture she skipped. She had already known the material. The cafeteria incident. She had been mildly inconvenienced for 24 hours by an environmental hazard that would have been a routine Tuesday on her home planet, recovered at 4 times the projected rate, and come out of it with a new language skill. She was not struggling. I understood that now with sudden and absolute clarity. She was not struggling at all. She was walking through this academy, with its reduced gravity and its labeled cafeteria panels and its introductory lectures, with the same ease that she walked through everything else. She was, by the objective data now sitting in front of me, almost certainly the single most physically durable student currently enrolled in the academy. I had been about to send her home. The recommendation was still in my outgoing queue and signed. I stared at it for a moment. Then I moved it to a holding folder and closed the outgoing queue. I needed to think. I needed specifically to think about a section of the file I had not yet reached. The last section, the one the Accord's preliminary contact team had labeled with a heading that I will admit made me pause before I opened it. The heading was not dramatic. It was not alarming in tone. It was written in the same flat official language as every other section of the document. It said, Observed Behavioral Traits, General. And then under that heading in clear translated text, the contact team had written the following. Humans demonstrate consistent high-functioning performance under extreme physical and psychological stress. They show strong cooperative behavior in crisis situations, significantly stronger than baseline performance in routine situations, suggesting the species performs at a higher level when circumstances are dangerous. Their threat assessment capability is sophisticated and rapid. They make effective decisions under time pressure. They are exceptionally difficult to discourage by conventional means. The final line of the section read, The primary challenge in first contact engagement with Sol-3 representatives may not be their capability. Their capability is not in question. The primary challenge may be finding a framework in which they feel sufficiently trusted to cooperate, rather than competing. I read that final line 3 times. Then I looked at the camera feed from the Academy Common Area, where students gathered in the late morning between lectures. I found her quickly. She was sitting alone at a table near the long window that looked out onto the practice lawns, eating something she had brought from her own quarters, reading from a small device she held in her left hand. She had bandaged her right forearm, I noticed, a fresh wrap, neat and precise. I did not know yet where that injury had come from. She looked up once, at nothing in particular. Just a glance at the window, at the pale blue sky of Veth Prime, at whatever she could see from where she sat. Then she looked back down at her reading. She did not look like the most physically durable student in the academy. She did not look like someone from a world that the Accord's biological classification system had rated as an extreme hazard environment. She looked like a young woman eating her lunch and reading before her next class. I thought about the gray bar at the bottom of her file. I thought about the person in the diplomatic office who had put it there. I thought about what it meant that someone had known all of this, all of it, and had sent her here anyway, into a school where the assessor responsible for evaluating her had been given a file with a blank section where the most important information lived. And then, because I was very good at my job and had been doing it for 19 years, I started asking myself the question I should have asked from the beginning. Not what is wrong with her, but what does she know that I don't? The answer, I was beginning to understand, was quite a lot. I want to tell you about the day in Laboratory 7, because it is the day I stopped pretending that what I was doing was professional data collection and admitted to myself that I had been wrong about Mara Ellis from the first moment she sat down across my desk. But before I tell you about that day, I need to tell you about the morning before it. I had spent 2 days since reading the full Sol-3 file, revising everything I thought I understood about the student I had almost removed from the academy. I had gone back through her first week records with new eyes. I had pulled the surveillance footage from orientation day and watched her walk through the gravity equalization zone, the corridor near the main entrance where the field generators stepped new arrivals down gradually from whatever gravity they had arrived with. Most students move through that corridor slowly, one hand on the guide rail, letting their bodies adjust. Mara Ellis had walked through at a steady, even pace, not touching the rail, and had turned left at the end of it and gone straight to find her assigned dormitory without stopping. I had flagged that observation and added it to a private file I was building separately from her official record. A file that was, in retrospect, less about her academic standing and more about the fact that I could not stop thinking about everything I had read and how little of it matched the student I had dismissed in under 10 minutes on the day of her assessment. She had passed the xenobiology re-examination with a grade in the upper third as I had required. She had, in fact, scored the highest mark in her cohort on the re-examination, which her professor noted in a brief communication to the academic office with what I interpreted as surprise that shaded toward irritation. She had attended every lecture since our meeting. She had submitted 3 additional voluntary analyses on topics outside the required coursework. Not for credit, just submitted, as if she had read the reference texts and found herself with observations worth recording. On the morning before Laboratory 7, I had received a separate communication from the xenobiology department, flagging a different concern entirely. One of the other students in her cohort, a Velhari male named Dross, whose species communicated social hierarchy through a combination of posture and low-frequency sound that their vocal apparatus produced involuntarily, had apparently been engaging in what translated roughly as deliberate acoustic pressure toward Mara Ellis during shared laboratory sessions. It was not uncommon. The Velhari did this with new students from lower status worlds as a kind of automatic sorting behavior, and most students either learned to ignore it or requested a cohort transfer after a few weeks. The flag was submitted because Mara Ellis had done neither. According to the laboratory supervisor's notes, she had turned to Dross during the previous session, looked at him with the specific expression the supervisor described as polite and completely unreadable and said, in perfectly accented high formal Veth, "I understand what that sound means. You should know it does not work on me. Not because I am dismissing your communication, but because where I come from, that kind of pressure is so routine that I genuinely cannot feel it anymore. If you would like to speak to me directly, I am very willing to listen." Dross had apparently stopped making the sound. I made a note in my private file. Then I went to check on the re-examination results again, as if looking at them a second time would tell me something the first look had not. It did not. She had simply done extremely well, and I was running out of professional reasons to keep her case in an active review status. I had almost decided to close the review file and formalize her continued enrollment when the alarm sounded from Laboratory 7. I was 2 corridors away when it went off, not the general campus alert, which was a 3-tone sequence most students learned to recognize in their first week, but the specific 2-tone alarm that meant a biological containment event in the research wing. The research wing was not part of the standard student curriculum. Students did not have access to Laboratory 7, but Mara Ellis, I would learn in the 90 seconds it took me to reach the corridor outside the lab, had been authorized a voluntary research observation hour by the xenobiology professor who had been impressed by her voluntary submissions. She had been inside when the containment failure occurred. I arrived at the observation corridor to find 3 academy staff members standing at the sealed door running the standard emergency procedure, which was to keep the door sealed and wait for the security response team, who were 4 minutes out from their station. Through the reinforced observation panel in the door, I could see the interior of the laboratory. It was a large room, research grade, with specimen enclosures along the far wall and a central work area with fixed tables and mounted equipment. 3 students, Mara Ellis and 2 Veth students from the advanced biology track, were inside. One of the Veth students was behind an overturned table. The other was pressed against the wall near the specimen station. The 3rd enclosure from the left had been breached. I will describe what was in that enclosure, because understanding what was in it is necessary for understanding what happened next. The Veth apex predator used in advanced biological research, the species catalogued as VEL-7 in the Academy Specimen Registry, is approximately 2 meters in length, 6-limbed, with a naturally armored outer carapace that resists most standard containment tools. It hunts using a combination of heat sensing and motion detection. Its secondary limbs, the smaller pair near the front of its body, end in narrow, hardened points that the species uses to breach the shells of prey animals. It produces an acidic compound in a gland near its jaw that it uses to pre-process food. It is not, by any measure, an animal that should have been in the same room as 3 students with no combat training and no weapons. It had been in the room for approximately 3 minutes when I reached the observation panel. The 2 Veth students were where I described them. Behind cover, which was the correct instinct, the VEL-7 was moving in a slow arc across the center of the room. responding to heat signatures from all three humans, from all three students, tracking the warmest sources. Mara Ellis was standing in the open. I want to be clear about this. She was not in cover. She was not pressed against a wall. She was standing in the open center of the room, approximately 4 meters from the animal, and she was watching it the way I had watched her during our first interview. With complete, focused, unblinking attention. Her posture was not rigid. It was not the posture of someone who was frozen. It was the posture of someone who was thinking very quickly and had decided that standing still was the right decision. The animal tracked her. It oriented toward her, the largest heat signature in the room, and began to close the distance with the slow, deliberate movement that predators use when they have identified a target and are calculating the correct approach. She sideways, not backward, sideways. She kept the same distance between them and moved in a partial arc, drawing the animal's tracking orientation with her, away from the direction of the other two students. I realized within seconds that she was doing this deliberately, keeping herself as the primary heat source in the animal's perception, pulling its attention with her own body, creating space between it and the students who were in cover. The staff members beside me were on communication devices, updating the security team on the situation. Nobody was watching through the panel but me. She kept moving. The animal followed. She was reading its behavior the way the file had said her species read danger, continuously, rapidly, updating every second. When it accelerated, she accelerated. When it slowed, she slowed. She was not trying to escape it. She was, I understood after another 30 seconds, managing it. It lunged. The movement was fast, much faster than the slow tracking approach. A sudden full-body surge toward her. She moved to the side and the animal's primary limbs missed her, but the secondary limb, the narrow pointed one on the right side, caught the outer part of her left forearm with a glancing contact. The point broke the surface. She hissed sharply through her teeth, a sound I heard even through the reinforced panel, and then she looked at her arm for approximately 2 seconds, reassessed the injury, and kept moving. My hand was on the door release. Academy protocol said to keep it sealed. I kept it sealed. She had not gone down. She had not stopped. She looked at her arm, calculated what it meant for her continued function, and made a decision about it in less time than it had taken me to reach for the release. She moved to the far side of the room, toward the equipment along the wall, and without slowing she reached up and pulled a heavy portable light unit from its mount. One of the freestanding research lamps used for detailed specimen work, broad spectrum, intense output. She turned it on and held it between herself and the animal. The Vel 7 stopped. Its heat-sensing organs, which were located in the facial plate, were extremely sensitive. The broad-spectrum output from the lamp was, to its sensory system, overwhelming. A wall of heat signal that drowned out the directional tracking data it needed to locate prey. It stopped and held position, disoriented, the way the animal always reacted to sensory disruption. She held the lamp steady and walked it, calm and slow, one careful step at a time, backward across the room toward the far wall, keeping the animal between herself and the corner. The Vel 7 tracked the lamp. It followed the strongest signal. She walked it into the corner and held it there, the lamp steady in her uninjured right hand, her left arm bleeding onto the floor in a slow pattern of drops that she was clearly aware of and had decided, again, was a problem for later. The security team arrived 40 seconds after that. They had containment equipment. Standard procedure took another 3 minutes to fully secure the animal. When the door opened and the team moved in, I went in with them. The 2 Veth students came out from behind cover. One was visibly shaking. The other had a minor injury on one shoulder that the medic attending them immediately began treating. Both were taken to the medical station. Ellis walked to the first aid cabinet on the wall near the entry door, opened it, and began selecting materials. I crossed the room to her. "There is a medical team outside," I said. "I know," she said. She was reading the labels on the materials with the same calm attention she applied to everything. "I will go to the medical station after I have this wrapped. It is not deep enough to need immediate intervention." She selected a dressing and began applying it to her forearm with practiced, efficient movements. One hand worked while the other held the wound pressed. She was not struggling with the task. She had clearly done this, or something very like it, before. "You should let the medic do that," I said. She glanced at me. "The medic is with the other 2 students. They needed it more urgently." She pressed the dressing into place, secured it, and checked the wrap with 2 fingers. "There, I will go now." She started toward the door. Then she stopped and looked back at the room. At the security team finishing up with the specimen, at the equipment, at the lamp still sitting on the floor of the corner where she had walked the animal. She looked at the drops of her own blood on the floor, a small scattered trail across the white surface of the laboratory, and something crossed her face. Not distress. I would not call it distress. It was quieter than that. It was the expression of someone who had been in a difficult place and come out of it, and was now looking back at the shape of it from the other side. Then she turned and walked out of the room and went to find the medical station, and I stood in Laboratory 7, holding her student file in my hand and looking at the floor and understanding, with the clarity that only comes when you have been completely and utterly wrong about something, and the evidence is right in front of you, that I had come to this room today to deliver a document that I no longer had any intention of submitting. I went back to my office. I sat down. I opened my private file on Mara Ellis. I added a new entry. Lab 7 incident, today's date, full account, and then I sat for a long time, not working, just thinking. There was a question I needed to ask her. I had been circling it for days, telling myself I was gathering data, telling myself it was professional due diligence. But sitting in my office after Lab 7, I understood that I was past the point where I could pretend it was professional. I wanted to know, and the reason I wanted to know had less to do with her academic record, and more to do with the fact that in 3 weeks I had gone from being certain I understood exactly what she was, to being certain that I had been wrong about almost everything, and I needed to understand how that had happened. I needed to understand her. I sent her a request for a formal debrief, scheduled for 2 days after Lab 7 to give her time to recover. Her response came within the hour. It said, "Confirmed, I will be there." In the medical report that came through later that day, the physician who treated her wound noted that it had already begun to close by the time she arrived at the medical station, and that she had pre-treated it correctly with the materials from the first aid kit, and that her pain response during the wound assessment was, and I quote directly from the report, inconsistent with the observed severity of the injury, suggesting either extremely high pain tolerance or prior experience with similar injuries. The physician had asked her, apparently, whether she had been injured this way before. She had said, "Not exactly this way, but the general category, yes." He had asked what that meant. She had said, "Growing up where I grew up." He had written that in the report without further comment, which I thought was a reasonable response, because there was very little you could say to that. She arrived at my office on time, which I had expected. She sat in the same chair she had used for our first meeting, with the same stillness, though this time her left arm rested on the chair arm, with a slight deliberateness that told me the wound was still making itself known. She had not mentioned it when she sat down. She had said hello, settled into the chair, and waited. I had thought carefully about how to begin this conversation. I had drafted questions and discarded them. I had reviewed the file again, and the private notes and the Lab 7 account. In the end, I decided the cleanest approach was the one she herself had seemed to prefer in our first meeting: directness. "I want to understand something," I said. "All right," she said. "I have read your complete file," I said. "Not the standard admissions file, the full origin world record, including the sections that were sealed." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I thought you might, eventually. You knew the sections were sealed." "I knew there was a redaction," she said. "I assumed it was standard. But I also knew that if anyone with sufficient clearance looked carefully at the physical flags from my intake screening, they would want the context. The redaction was always going to draw attention to itself eventually." "It took me 3 weeks," I said. "Yes," she said, with a slight inclination of her head that I could not fully interpret. "I want to ask you about Earth," I said. "Not the data. I have the data. I want to ask you about what it is actually like, from where you stand, what it means to come from there." She considered this. She looked past me for a moment, at the window, at the pale sky outside. Then she looked back. "It means you learn early," she said, "that the world is not arranged for your comfort. That the thing you are walking through, the forest, the street, the river, the ocean, is not waiting to hurt you, but it is not waiting to protect you either. You are part of it. You belong to it as much as anything else does. And belonging to it means you develop a working relationship with difficulty." "A working relationship," I repeated. "We do not pretend difficulty is not there," she said. "We do not believe that safety is the natural state of things. We'll build towards safety constantly, and we celebrate it when we have it, but we do not make the mistake of thinking it will stay without maintenance. My grandmother used to say that a life without challenge is not peace, it is stagnation. And stagnation where she lived was more dangerous than an active threat, because at least an active threat you could see." I thought about the Vel 7 in the corner of Laboratory 7, held there by a lamp, and the calm refusal of a young woman from a hazard class world to be moved. Why did you stay in the open? I asked. In the laboratory, protocol is to take cover and wait for security. She nodded. I know. But cover was already occupied by the other 2 students. If I had taken cover, the animal would have tracked the exposed heat signatures more easily. It would have gone for one of the others first. They were still in its sensory range. By staying in the open, I gave it a larger, clearer target, me, and drew its focus away from them. You made yourself the primary target on purpose, I said. Yes. That is not a standard response. No, she agreed, but it was the correct one. I looked at her for a moment. She met my gaze evenly. There was nothing in her expression that sought approval. No waiting for me to confirm that she had done well. She had assessed the situation, made a decision, and acted on it, and now she was describing that process to me the way you describe any sequence of logical steps, clearly, without performance. Were you afraid? I asked. She paused. It was the first question that had made her pause. She said, Of course I was afraid. I saw that animal move when it first came out of the enclosure, and my entire body told me to get behind something. She looked at her bandaged arm. Fear is not the problem. Fear is useful. Fear tells you that something important is happening, and that you need to pay attention. The problem is only when you let fear make the decision for you instead of informing it. You described fear as useful, I said, not as something to overcome. Overcoming fear is the wrong frame, she said. Fear does not need to be overcome. It needs to be heard and then directed. Every person I know from home would tell you the same thing. You do not become brave by not being afraid. You become brave by being afraid and doing the necessary thing anyway, and after you have done it enough times, the doing of it becomes familiar. She glanced at her arm again. The fear does not go away. You just stop being surprised by it. I sat back in my chair. I was thinking about something she had said, a word she had used, home, and the way she said it, not with sadness. Not with the careful, neutral distance that most beings use when they are describing a place they have left behind. With a kind of warmth that I did not expect, given everything I had read about what that place was. You love Earth, I said. It came out less like a question than I intended. She smiled, and it was genuine. The same almost smile I had seen in the corner of her mouth during our first meeting, but fuller now, unguarded. Very much, she said. I know what it is. I know what the file says about it. I know that from the outside, it looks like a catalog of things trying to end you. She paused. But it is also full of things so beautiful that they are difficult to describe to someone who has not stood inside them. The light at a certain time of day over a certain kind of forest. The sound of the ocean before a storm. The way snow looks when it falls for the first time in a season and everything gets quiet all at once. She looked at the window. I miss it every day. I intend to go back to it when I am done here. But I intend to go back having done what I came here to do. And what did you come here to do? I asked. It was the same question I had asked in our first meeting, but I was asking it differently now. Not as an assessor testing a student's stated motivation, but as someone who wanted a real answer. She turned from the window and looked at me directly. My planet is in trouble, she said. Not the way it was in trouble in the historical records. The wars, the near extinctions, the things we caused ourselves. Differently. There are things happening now that we cannot solve with the tools we have. Climate patterns shifting faster than our models predicted. Ecological systems losing stability in ways that need intervention at a scale we have not yet achieved. We have been trying to fix it ourselves for decades and we are making progress. But progress is slow and time is not unlimited. She paused. Her voice was steady. There was no request in it. She was simply telling me a fact. The Accord has knowledge and technology that could accelerate what we are trying to do by generations, she said. We cannot access it without formal membership. We cannot achieve formal membership without relationships. Relationships require trust. Trust requires presence over time. She met my eyes. I am the presence. I am here to build trust by being here long enough and doing well enough that the Accords stop seeing Solio 3 was a distant star with a diplomatic application and start seeing it as a world that sent its best person and meant it. The room was quiet. Outside the window, the campus was going about its afternoon. Students moving between buildings, a group of Veth cadets crossing the practice lawn in formation, the ordinary movement of an ordinary day. I am not your best person, I said. I mean, you may be your best candidate for this program, but I have read your planet's records. Sulri has produced individuals of significant capability. She looked at me steadily. I did not say I was the best person on Earth. I said they sent their best person for this. She paused. Those are different things. The best person for this is not the strongest or the most decorated. It is the one most likely to walk into an unfamiliar world, be told they are not wanted, absorb every obstacle, and still be standing at the end of the year having done the work. She looked at the bandage on her arm. I do not know with certainty that I am that person. I know that I intend to be. I looked at her for a long time without speaking. The elimination notice was still in my holding folder. It had been there for 12 days. I had moved it once, when I thought I was done deliberating, and then moved it back when I was not. I did not move it that afternoon either, but I knew, sitting in that quiet office with the afternoon light coming through the window and Mara Ellis across the table from me, telling me about snow and oceans and a planet that was struggling and a species that had decided to reach outward with open hands, that the deliberation was over. I had made a decision. I just needed to write it down. I did not write the elimination notice. I want to be clear about that from the beginning of this account, because the rest of what I have to tell you only makes sense if you understand the sequence. I read a file, I watched a student, I sat across a desk from her and listened, and then I wrote a different document entirely. The document I wrote was 43 pages long, which is, for the record, the longest assessment report I had submitted in 19 years of professional evaluation. The standard assessment report is between 4 and 8 pages. My colleagues, when they heard about it later, found this detail both characteristic and mildly alarming, which tells you something about how they think and something about how I work. The first section was a formal reversal of the elimination recommendation. I stated clearly that the initial recommendation had been filed on the basis of incomplete data, specifically the redacted sections of the Sol3 origin file, and that a full review of that data, combined with observed student performance, rendered the recommendation without merit. I included the regulation that required the diplomatic office to provide full origin world data to assessing staff when that data was material to the assessment, and the subclause that made the redaction of material data a procedural violation. I did this carefully, in neutral official language, without accusation, because the goal was not to create a dispute, but to create a record that would prevent it from happening again to the next human student who arrived. Then I wrote the core of the report. I wrote about what I had read in the Sol3 file, not as a summary but as an analysis what it meant, in practical terms, for the Academy to have a student from an extreme hazard world in its general population, what it meant for our understanding of human physical and psychological capacity, what the behavioral data suggested about their potential as accord partners, not in the distant theoretical future that most species imagine when Earth's application comes up in diplomatic discussions, but now, concretely, in the form of a 24-year-old woman who had arrived on a politically motivated admission and proceeded to outscore her cohort, manage a laboratory crisis with no training and no tools beyond her own instincts and a portable lamp, and conduct herself throughout with a consistency and clarity of purpose that I had not encountered in a student of any species in my career. I wrote about what it meant that she had been afraid in Laboratory 7 and stayed in the open anyway. I wrote about the phrase she had used. Fear does not need to be overcome. It needs to be heard and then directed, and explained why that framing was not inspirational language, but a behavioral description of a functional psychological tool that the Accord's own crisis response training tried to teach with moderate success, and that she appeared to carry as a native capability. I wrote about her planet. I wrote about the gravity, the biosphere, the history, the specific quality of toughness that is produced when a species spends hundreds of thousands of years inside a hazard class environment, not as an anomaly, not as a disaster, but as a home. I wrote about the immune system and the pain response and the bone density and the muscle fiber composition, not as a list of impressive statistics, but as evidence of what it means when a species evolves for difficulty, that they do not merely tolerate it, they process it, they integrate it, they bring it with them as a set of tools that most other species have never needed to develop. And then, at the end of the 43 pages, I wrote a recommendation, not for Mara Ellis's enrollment status, that had been resolved in the first section. This recommendation was directed to the Academy Director, to the Faculty Council, and with a copy to the Accord Diplomatic Division. I recommended that the Sol3 formal membership application be elevated from observer status to accelerated review, with a timeline of 18 months, rather than the standard 7 years. I recommended that the Academy's Xenobiology Department develop a formal research collaboration with Sol3's scientific bodies, with Mara Ellis serving as the initial liaison contact. I recommended that the Academy's Survival Integration Curriculum, the one-semester course, taught by a VETH officer with no relevant field experience, be reviewed and updated with input from Sol3 representatives, specifically in the areas of threat assessment, injury management under active conditions, and cooperative crisis response. And I recommended, in a final paragraph that I rewrote 4 times before I was satisfied with it, that the Accord's standard framework for evaluating new species be reviewed. Specifically, the section that used size, gravity, and biosphere complexity as primary indicators of threat potential. Because those indicators were designed to identify species that posed a threat to the Accord, they had never been designed to identify species that posed a threat to the Accord's assumptions about itself. Solry was not a threat to the Accord. I wrote that explicitly, clearly, and without qualification. Solry was a mirror, looking at what humanity had survived, what they had built inside a world actively trying to unmake them, and what they had decided to do with those capabilities. Not to conquer outward, not to demand recognition, but to send a student to a school where she was not wanted and tell her to be patient and do the work. Looking at all of that, and then looking at the Accord's diplomatic institutions, and their categories, and their redaction blocks, and their standard assessment timelines, you saw something that was, if you were paying attention, quietly humbling. They were not waiting to be invited in. They had been knocking on the door for years. They simply had the particular human quality of continuing to knock after most species would have walked away. I submitted the report on a Thursday morning. By that afternoon I had received 3 responses, 2 from the Faculty Council, 1 from the Diplomatic Division. The Faculty Council responses were cautious, the kind of careful institutional language that means we see what you are saying, and we are not sure what to do with it yet. The Diplomatic Division response was 1 sentence. Acknowledged. The Solry file redaction policy is under internal review. 3 days later, Mara Ellis came back to my office. Not for a scheduled meeting. She appeared in the doorway in the late afternoon and knocked on the open door and asked if she was interrupting. I told her she was not. She sat in the same chair with the same stillness and she said, "I heard you submitted a report." I said. "I have not read it," she said. "I understand it is part of an active review and not available to students. But I heard from the xenobiology professor that it was significant." She paused. "I wanted to thank you." "You do not need to thank me," I said. "I was correcting an error." "You corrected it," she said. "That is the part that matters." She looked at me for a moment. Most people, when they realize they have made a mistake, find a way to frame it so the mistake was reasonable, so the error had an explanation, so they come out of it having been mostly right with 1 small adjustment. She tilted her head slightly. "You wrote 43 pages. I looked at her. "How did you know it was 43 pages? She looked at the window with the expression that was distinctly not answering my question, and then back at me with the almost smile and said, "My world is in trouble. I pay attention." I let that stand without pursuing it. She stood to go, and then paused at the door the same way she had the first time. That same pause, that same looking back. It occurred to me that it was not actually hesitation. It was the pause of someone who checks over their shoulder, not from anxiety, but from habit, making sure nothing has been left behind. A thoroughly reasonable instinct, I thought, for someone from a world where paying attention to what was behind you was not optional. "When the Accord Summit happens," she said, "and I believe it will happen, because that report will work its way through the system and someone at the top will read it and understand what it means when it happens, I hope you will attend." "As an observer," I said. "As someone who was wrong about something and changed his mind," she said. "That is actually more valuable than an observer. It is the rarest thing in any institution." She smiled, fully, this time, unguarded, the smile of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had found, briefly, a place to set it down. "Earth thanks you. I know that sounds formal, but I mean it." She left. I sat in my office in the late afternoon light, and I thought about the elimination notice sitting in my desk drawer, the one I had never submitted, the one I had kept as a reminder of what I had almost done. I thought about gray bars at the bottom of files and what is hidden under them, and why, and what it costs when important things are hidden from the people who need to see them. I thought about a species that evolved inside danger and came out of it with patience and open hands and a quality of quiet, unrelenting persistence that I did not yet have a name for in any language I spoke. And I thought about something she had said weeks ago in our first conversation, when I told her that she was here as a symbol and not because anyone had selected her on merit. She had said, "I know. I came anyway." 3 months after that afternoon, the Accord convened its first formal diplomatic summit with Sol 3 representatives. There were 7 humans at the table. Mara Ellis was among them, the only one who had been there from the beginning, still wrapping her own bandages, still arriving early, still watching doorways with the particular sideways attention of someone whose evolutionary history had made awareness a reflex rather than an effort. I was in the observer gallery as she had suggested. One of the senior counselors, An elder Veth diplomat with decades of experience at exactly these kinds of tables leaned toward me during a recess and said quietly that she found the humans difficult to read. She said they sat very still and they listened too carefully, and they answered questions with a precision that she was not accustomed to from species at their level of development. She asked me, in the way that senior diplomats ask junior staff things when they want context without asking for it formally, what I thought about them. I thought about Laboratory 7. I thought about 43 pages. I thought about snow and oceans and a pale gray sky and a young woman who had arrived somewhere she was not wanted and refused, with complete calm and no visible effort, to leave. They are exactly what they appear to be. I told her, they are simply not what anyone expected. She considered this. Then she said, are they safe to engage with formally? I looked down at the table, where Mara Ellis was in quiet conversation with the Accord's lead scientific liaison, explaining something with a small, precise movement of her hands. Yes, I said, as long as you are honest with them. Honesty is non-negotiable for them. I suspect it is a survival trait. They live in an environment where miscalculating reality gets you hurt, so they developed a very low tolerance for information that is not accurate. I paused. But if you are honest, and you follow through on what you say, they will meet you more than halfway, every time. The counselor was quiet for a moment. That is a simpler set of conditions than most species require, she said. Yes, I agreed, it is. The summit lasted 4 days. By the end of it, a preliminary framework had been agreed upon for accelerated review of Sol-3's membership application, along with 3 joint research proposals and a cultural exchange program. It was not a completed membership. It was a beginning. Beginnings, I had come to understand, were what humans were best at. They had been beginning things on that difficult and beautiful and dangerous planet of theirs, for as long as there had been anyone to record it. They began and they failed, and they began again and they failed differently. And they began a third time, with what they had learned from the first 2 failures, and they kept doing this, across centuries, across near extinctions, across the long, slow accumulation of everything that an unforgiving world could put in their way. And they had arrived here, at this table, with open hands and honest eyes and a patience that was, as I had come to understand it, not the absence of urgency but the presence of certainty. Certainty that if they kept showing up, eventually the door would open. The elimination notice is still in my desk drawer. I have been asked, since the summit, whether I intend to file it as a closed case or dispose of it. I have done neither. I keep it there, in the back of the top drawer, under a set of current files, not as a punishment for myself, not as a monument to the mistake I nearly made. I keep it because it is useful to have something in front of you that reminds you that the most important data is sometimes the data you have not yet read, that the gray bar at the bottom of a file is not bureaucratic clutter, that the person sitting across your desk who has come early and is sitting very still and waiting for you to say something difficult is possibly, in ways you have not yet understood, the most capable individual in the room. The Accord is a structure built by beings who believe they know, broadly, what kinds of intelligence the galaxy produces and what those intelligences need and what they are worth. We built the structure with genuine intention. We maintain it with genuine care. But we built it from the inside, which means there are things it cannot see, because those things are outside the frame. Mara Ellis walked through the frame and sat down and did not ask for the frame to expand. She simply demonstrated, day after day, question after question, crisis after crisis, that it needed to. Structures that do not update their assumptions eventually fail the beings they were built to serve. This is true of governments, of institutions, of individual minds. It is one of the things that is most difficult to do. To look at what you believe you know, find the gray bar at the bottom of it, and decide to open it anyway. She knew I had filed to remove her from the program. She had known for weeks. She had come anyway. And when I finally asked her, in that last conversation, whether she had ever considered leaving, taking the political exit that was available to her, going home to the planet she loved and the oceans she missed, she had looked at me with those gray-green eyes and said simply, the door was not open yet. She said it the way someone says a thing that requires no further explanation, as if waiting, simply and stubbornly and without drama, for a door to open was the most natural thing in the world. For a human, I realized, it probably was. The summit framework was signed on the final morning. I watched from the gallery as each representative placed their identification mark on the document. The Accord counselors with their formal stamp, the Sol-3 delegation with their written signatures, a practice their species had used for thousands of years and had never entirely abandoned, even as technology offered other options. Mara Ellis was the last to sign. She held the pen for a moment before she used it, and I thought I saw her press her lips together briefly. Not sadness, not nerves. Something smaller than either of those. The private acknowledgement of a very long road ending at a specific point and another road beginning immediately after. Then she signed. Neat, quick, complete. She looked up once before the session closed, and her gaze moved through the observer gallery with the automatic sideways attention that I had come to think of as entirely characteristic of her species, checking what was behind, what was beside, what was overhead, the continuous low-level environmental awareness of a being who had learned, from their very first days in a world that did not arrange itself for their comfort, that attention was survival. Her eyes found mine for a moment. She nodded, brief, certain. I nodded back. Outside the summit building, the pale sky of Eth Prime went on as it always did, enormous and pale blue, and entirely indifferent to what had just happened inside. The twin suns moved through their arc. The city went about its ordinary business. Students crossed the academy lawns. Life continued in all its unremarkable detail. Somewhere, several thousand light-years away, a yellow dwarf star burned in the outer arm of the galaxy, circled by a small planet with a gravity 35% higher than this one. A biosphere rated extreme hazard, a history full of difficulty and recovery and beginning again, and oceans that made a specific sound before a storm. A sound Mara Ellis missed every day. A sound she intended to go back to when the work was done. The work was not done. It was, as I said, only beginning. But beginnings, I had learned this, in the end, from her, are the most important thing. You cannot arrive at anything without them. You cannot open a door without first showing up in front of it and deciding, against all reasonable expectation, that the door will open. She had known it would open. She had simply been willing to wait.